Thank you for joining today's NILE webinar. This is Brianne Van Dyne, the Education Manager with Immunize Nevada, and I will be today's moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to review a couple of housekeeping items. First, please locate the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you have any questions, type them in the chat box and we will address those questions throughout the presentation. Secondly, if you have requested nursing or pharmacy continuing education credits for today's webinar, please make sure that you complete the survey in the post-webinar email. The email will be sent out by the end of today, and all CEUs will be mailed out within the next week. A little disclaimer, Immunize Nevada NILE webinars are made possible by the generosity of speakers who donate their time and expertise to the benefit of the Coalition. The expectation and goal is for community partners to gain knowledge on immunization-related topics through a non-branded, unbiased presentation. I'd like to now turn it over to our speaker, Dr. Vanessa Slotz, who is the Department Chief of General Pediatrics with Renown Children's Hospital. Dr. Slotz went to Texas Lutheran University for her undergraduate education and attended medical school at the American University of the Caribbean on the island of St. Martin. She completed rotations at varied locations, including Northern England, Brooklyn, Chicago, and Phoenix, which highlighted the differences in medical practice around our country and beyond. She attended the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga School of Medicine for her general pediatrics residency. Dr. Slotz and her husband moved to Reno in 2013 and has been practicing general pediatrics for the last 4 years. Dr. Slotz, we'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Super. Thank you so much for having me today, and welcome everyone. Again, as a reminder, if you do have questions, go ahead and throw them out as we are going through, and we will try to address those in time. Today we are talking about alternate vaccine schedules and what's the big deal. I think we are all getting a lot more requests for alternate vaccine schedules, and we are going to kind of look at our current CDC guidelines. We'll discuss the safety and efficacy of those guidelines as well as vaccines. We'll look at alternate vaccine schedules, most prominently the Dr. Sears schedule, as that's the one I think we see probably the most, and looking at the concerns with spreading out vaccines, and anything that we don't discuss under that heading we will kind of wrap up in those kind of addressing some common concerns. So I'm sure everybody is familiar with our CDC vaccine schedule. It comes out once a year with very minimal changes to it. Most of the time it is roughly the same with a few changes that have happened more so recently in the adolescent realm. And so you can certainly review that on the website, but I'm sure most all of you guys are familiar. If we look at our rates in Nevada, if we're looking at the combined 7 series, which is going to be your birth to 35-month vaccination series. For Nevada, we are sitting at about 71.9%. And if you take a look, we are kind of on par with Arizona and Utah. We're doing a little bit better than California and Oregon, and then there's a few of our surrounding states that are doing better. And you can see kind of where we are sitting in conjunction to the rest of the United States. We had some improvement in this, but have really been staying relatively steady for the last few years. So why are we only about 70% up to date? And this, again, is not something that is just an issue with us, and we are seeing it in our research. And so in 2008, GUST gave a paper that showed that 28% of parents had doubts about vaccinations. And the AAP periodic survey in 2013 showed that 87% of pediatricians reported encountering parents who delayed or refused vaccines, which is up from the 2006 survey, which only showed about 75%. And in 2015, leaks showed that about 13% of parents are delaying or selecting out of certain vaccines. And so with knowing that data, it's becoming harder and harder to keep our kids up to date fully as we're going around. And a lot of parents are coming with the concern of, can we spread out these vaccines? And it was interesting, in 2015 there was an article that was published in Pediatrics in which Kimpin and their group surveyed family medicine and pediatric providers, and 93% of them reported that parents requested spreading out vaccines in a typical month. So they got that request. That was more commonly reported by pediatrics versus family medicine, which is pretty standard, I would think, as we're certainly going to see more children in the pediatrics department, and so we are going to encounter that a little bit more readily. And what they did also look at in this study was how often are providers saying, sure, let's spread out those vaccines. And in the 2015 study, 37% of providers said they will often or always agree to spread out vaccines. And this is up from their 2009 survey, which showed only 13%. So pretty significant increase over those 6 years. And the biggest reasons that providers said that they were willing to spread out vaccines is that it thought it might build trust between themselves and the parents, with the hope that at some point they may decide to not spread them out and go ahead and get on track. 80% said they thought families might leave their practice if they didn't agree to spread out the vaccines. But on the other side of that, about 35% felt like it sent mixed messages. So we say how important this is and how safe the vaccine schedule is, and yet we say, yeah, sure, you can go ahead and spread those out. And so there's definitely some dissonance there. And about 40% reported that these requests really decrease their job satisfaction, and that has been shown to having discussions around vaccines, whether it's delaying, spreading out, or refusing altogether, that having those conversations are decreasing job satisfaction. And again, that's been seen in multiple studies. If we look at the parents' concerns, so this came out of that same survey, and what the providers reported as what the parents' concerns were, we can see that the top few concerns were, concerns that their child may suffer some long-term complications from vaccines, so that perhaps that maybe our vaccines are not safe. General worries about vaccines without any specific concern. Belief that their child is unlikely to get a vaccine preventable disease, and concern that their child may suffer immediate or short-term effects. And so, and then kind of rounding out the top 5 is parental concern that their child could develop autism as a result of vaccination. And so those are going to be kind of the top 5 reasons why a lot of parents were saying that they would rather do an alternate vaccine schedule. But certainly there is a whole realm of reasons why parents have concerns and are hesitant about vaccinations. So again, of the top reason there was really kind of surrounding vaccine safety, and perhaps they would develop some kind of long-term complications from receiving the vaccine. And so when we look at vaccine safety, we need to kind of start with the development. And vaccines have to demonstrate both safety and efficacy before licensure. If we look at regular medications that come out on the market, they don't really have to demonstrate either of those. They just kind of have to show that they may work, and then they do aftermarket studies. And so with vaccines, that has to all be done prior to their licensure. And so scientists and labs have to identify the need for vaccines and demonstrate an understanding of the immunity against the disease. They have to create the vaccine. Then they can do preclinical studies, and then at that point then they can submit to the FDA, and that's got to describe not only the process of the immunization, but also so how it's going to be manufactured, how it's going to be tested, and summarize all of their lab reports, all before they can really go through the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. So development of vaccines can take years, and then they can finally become licensed and then go onto the market. And at that point, we do continued long-term safety. This is not something that the vaccines go on the market and then we don't recognize where they go and how they affect our children. So there is the big vaccine adverse events reporting system, which is voluntary and passive, so anyone can actually put in a report there. A parent, a provider, a lawyer, anyone can put in a perceived side effect into the vaccine adverse reporting system. There's the vaccine safety data link, and there are millions involved in that, and most of that's done by providers. And so you can really detect rare events. One that kind of came out of that was the intussusception with the Rota virus vaccine came through the vaccine safety data link. There's the post-licensure rapid immunization safety monitoring system, which looks at insurance claims and again can monitor millions there. And again, that's going to be done by a provider. So these ones are going to be a little bit more clear to say that these are potential links in from an adverse event. And then there's also the clinical immunization safety assessment project. So lots of ways in which we look at long-term safety of our vaccinations. If we look again at our current CDC schedule, not only do they look at the safety of the vaccines, but they have to look at the timing in which these vaccines are given, and also are there going to be interactions with any other vaccines that are given during that time. And it is very thought out process in which where are these children going to be most at risk for these diseases, and so that is really how they've kind of set out their schedule. And if we look at the schedule, it prevents 42,000 deaths a year, prevents 20 million cases of disease, and can save $14 billion in direct medical costs. So it's not just something that is thrown together. This is something that has been very thoughtful and has been shown to be very efficacious in many different realms. And if, again, we look at that scheduled safety, it is the current vaccine schedule by the CDC is the only recommended schedule that is out there. And that safety of the CDC administration schedule was reaffirmed by the Institute of Medicine in 2013 and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And so, again, constant monitoring of our situation, and that vaccine schedule can change if needed, but nope, still affirmed by the IOM. And in fact, no alternative vaccine schedules have been evaluated and found to provide any better safety or efficacy than the CDC schedule. And so again, we're going to start talking about a little bit of our alternative vaccine schedules. And the reason we'll focus more on Dr. Sears, although the common thread is there with any alternate schedule, but I think most of us probably hear I would like to use the Dr. Sears schedule more frequently than any others. And he actually, in his book, has two different schedules. The one I think that's the most common is the alternate vaccine schedules, where they do 2 vaccines at a time all the way from 2 months to 8 years old. The selective vaccine schedule, I've actually never had anyone bring this to me. I don't know if you guys have, but they kind of do the first realm, and then they don't do any of the live virus, so like measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, and hepatitis A. They're looking to see if you have already some kind of innate immunity to that once you're 10, or if you've had those diseases, then you don't necessarily need those vaccines. So again, the selective schedule is not as popular, I think, as the alternative schedule, but wanted to put it up here just in case any of you guys have kind of come across it. And so what is the problem with looking at alternative schedules? And so, a lot of this comes, again, a lot of this comes from the internet, it comes from media, it comes from Dr. Sears' book, and most of this is really wanting parents to make informed decisions, but a lot of the information that they put out actually will misinform our parents, and that really includes the Dr. Sears book. And so a lot of this is showing good versus bad science. So most of what's on Facebook is bad science. In the Dr. Sears book, he never distinguishes between good and bad science. So the quality is not there. He's happy to put in a couple of different sources, but doesn't say why one study is better than the other, and it just really kind of feeds into parents' fears. And a lot of this is where the alternate schedule community comes out, is that their fears trump what science is actually showing. And we all know that there are some risks for vaccines. However, like we had talked about before, the vaccine adverse events reporting system is a bit of a misrepresentation because it can show coincidental and not causal associations, as anybody can go on and put in any kind of adverse event. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that's diagnosed. And so again, is more likely to represent coincidental events as opposed to causal events. And also, if we are looking at vaccine inserts and everything, companies have to list all of the adverse events that occurred after receipt of vaccine, even if they occurred at the same rate as placebo. And they don't have to indicate that on their insert either, that the comparison between the vaccine or the placebo. So it can be a little bit misleading, and if we have parents who are coming across that, they're not going to understand the correct science behind all of this, and again, their fears are really going to take over. And so the first thing is really understanding the research. And from the Dr. Sears book, it says, doctors, myself included, learn a lot about diseases in medical school, but we learn very little about vaccines. And I think that that is probably a reasonable statement, but there is a lot more behind that. So we do learn about the science, we learn about the vaccines and how they're made, but we don't need to be the ones to make those recommendations to the CDC. There are experts in virology, microbiology, statistics, epidemiology, and pathogenesis that evaluate the data from all of this research. And they are the experts. And they are going to be the ones that are going to be providing recommendations. So we really need to trust in the experts that are providing the recommendations to the CDC and the AAP for these vaccinations and for the current vaccine schedule. Natural immunity comes up a lot in these conversations, and I think probably a lot of us have potentially had chickenpox, but I think chickenpox is the one that I hear the most frequently about natural infection. Well, I had chickenpox as a kid, and isn't that going to be better than getting the vaccine? And this comes up a lot on, again, social media. It's in Dr. Sears' book about natural immunity is better than vaccine-induced immunity. And that is very true. However, the risk of natural immunity can be very severe. It can have a lot of morbidity associated with it, as well as mortality. And I think something really fantastic to be able to share with people is that during the past century, vaccines have increased the lifespan of the United States by 30 years. And so natural immunity is not all that it is cracked up to be, even if it may be slightly superior to vaccine-induced immunity. And so just looking at a couple of examples, with the conjugated pneumococcal vaccine, that became part of the routine schedule in 2000. Prior to the vaccine, there were 17,000 cases per year of invasive disease in children less than 5. 700 of those cases were meningitis, and they experienced 200 deaths per year from invasive disease. And so post-vaccine, those numbers have significantly declined. I think varicella, again, tends to be one of our biggest complaints because, again, most parents have had chickenpox and they are certainly alive and did not have any morbidity associated with it, but it is not the case for everybody. So in 1995 is when the one-dose varicella vaccine came into play. And you can see the marked drop in the number of deaths per 1 million after that vaccine, and it has just plummeted, whether the cause of death was varicella or if that was just a contributing cause. We can even break that down further by looking at age group. And pre-vaccine, there were 16 deaths per million in each age group of 1 to 4 and 5 to 9. Post-vaccine, there are 3 deaths per year in each of those age groups. So you can really see, again, in 1995 when that vaccine started as the one dose, all age groups under the age of 50, their mortality just plummeted. And the greatest reduction was 92% in that 1 to 4 years age group. So again, something as simple as chickenpox that we take for granted as being a quote-unquote simple illness really does come with a lot of mortality, and that vaccine has saved tons of lives. And so when we are talking about immunity, we also have to kind of look at our herd immunity. And we know that as immunization rates decline, that is going to decrease herd immunity and can put your entire community at risk. And if we look at that varicella, and we are seeing that decrease in morbidity and mortality because of that vaccine, that helped our entire community, not only in the young ones that received that vaccine, but also in our older community below that age of 50. And that herd immunity is contingent on a significant proportion of the population actually getting immune. And depending on the vaccine, you may need to have 30% of individuals to achieve that herd immunity, or it could be as much as 95% needed in order to get immunity. And I think that it is kind of funny, as a direct quote from Dr. Sears's book, I also warn parents not to share their fears with their neighbors, because if too many people avoid the MMR, we'll likely see the disease increase significantly. So obviously it's okay for the community to get this to protect that child whose parents don't want, but they don't want to necessarily contribute to that herd immunity. So again, a big fear is about the testing of vaccines. And Dr. Sears writes, a new medication goes through many years of trials in a select group of people to make sure it is safe. Vaccines, on the other hand, don't receive the same type of in-depth short-term testing or long-term safety research. And as we've already discussed, that is just wholly untrue. So much has to be taken into account prior to even looking at licensure, in which with medications it really just happens more in this phase where licensure can happen. And so again, we have to look at the medical need and the burden. We have to look, can we even make a vaccine? How does that immunity going to look? How are we going to manufacture it and develop it? What are the preclinical studies showing? Then we can go to the FDA and say, okay, can we start studies? And then they can start studies, and then finally they get to licensure. And again, we have so much post-licensure monitoring for vaccinations. And so the other piece is vaccines are naturally just tested in larger numbers of people for longer periods of time than any of our other medications. And so for a couple of examples, the HPV was tested in 30,000 women, the conjugated pneumococcal was tested in 40,000 children, and the rotavirus was actually tested in 70,000 children. So again, large numbers of sample here in order to be able to test our vaccines before they can be licensed. The other piece we kind of touched on already is a little bit of causation versus correlation. So some of those safety monitoring services like the VAERS, again, anybody can kind of put in there. So, is this a causative adverse event or is it just a correlation? And again, I like to pick on Dr. Sears because he even says there's no science behind his alternate vaccine schedule, and yet that's the one that's promoted so much. But sometimes infants and children develop medical problems within days or weeks of a vaccination. Although it can be highly suspected that the vaccine was the cause, it can't be proven. I'm sure the truth of the matter is somewhere in between causality and coincidence. So again, really just continuing to play into the fears of parents. And so, we look constantly at epidemiological studies. And so there are definitely things that we know can be causal. The measles-containing vaccine can cause thrombocytopenia. DTaP can lead to seizures. Thimerosal does not cause autism. There's no middle ground between coincidence and causality. It either causes an adverse event or it is a coincidence. There's nothing in between. And I think this is my favorite study, and if you guys happen to see my vaccine hesitation talk, this was in there because this slide just totally cracks me up, and that you can look and see that the rate of autism has increased, but so has the rate of organic food sales. So again, unless organic food is what is leading to our rise in autism, correlation does not imply causation. So, we've addressed a lot of the concerns that that a lot of people have and really bring to providers as to why they would like to do alternate vaccine schedules or spread out those vaccines. But a few others to just hit on. One is overloading the immune system. I think we probably hear that a lot. Neurological side effects, again, that was on one of the that was number 5 on the list of most parents' fears, is that they may receive autism from the vaccines. And then there's a lot of focus on preservatives and what is actually in our vaccines and can they cause any sort of adverse events. And so from the overloading the immune system, we know as providers that infants' immune system have the capacity to respond to thousands of antigens at any given time. So if their immune system is intact, that is what it's meant for. That is what we were built for. And they're exposed every day to issues with toys, shopping carts, playground equipment. The immune system is just constantly bombarded and it is constantly replenished. So again, if you have a fully functional immune system, there's no way to overwhelm the immune system. And while the amount of immunizations have certainly increased from perhaps when you were a child or perhaps when your parents were children, children are actually receiving fewer antigens than their parents. And there has been some interesting work to show that the response to multiple vaccines is the stress response and body's response for multiple vaccines is very similar to the response that occurs when vaccines are given separately. So when we actually separate vaccines out, they are getting more of a stress response to the body because it's happening every single time that they're getting vaccines instead of getting all their vaccines at once and their body going through one stress response. And so if we do kind of look at the amount of proteins and polysaccharides that are in our vaccines. If we look at the smallpox vaccine, there was about 200 proteins in there. In the 1960s with our vaccines there was about 3,200. And back when I got vaccines, we were still right about that 3,000 mark. And again, we have been able to now immunize against much more for less than even the smallpox vaccine. So currently, proteins and polysaccharides in all of those early vaccines, they're only getting less than 200 antigens during that time, and there are a lot. So like hepatitis B, one small little antigen. And so while we are immunizing against more, we're actually giving our children less because science is so amazing. Again, one of the big concerns that I think we are all aware of, and that it comes up on a lot of surveys, the one by Kemp's group as well, is that is it possible that these vaccines could cause autism? And again, Dr. Sears just plays right into those parents' fears by saying that some studies have been published in recent years that have failed to show statistical proof of a relationship between vaccines and autism. However, by the same token, it is often also difficult to prove that there is not a connection. And again, there is no middle ground between correlation and causation, and there have been many studies that have shown that there is significant statistical proof that there is not any higher prevalence of neurodevelopmental problems with the increased number of vaccines. After Andrew Wakefield retracted his research saying that it had been falsified, we have continued to do research study that has again showed statistically significant that there is no link between MMR and autism. And so when we are looking at this, it is just a temporal link or a coincidental link, and again, not a causal link. And that happens because, again, the MMR is given around the same time that autism is going to become a little bit more apparent, despite a lot of those symptoms being present earlier. And so there's a lot of interesting information that's coming out now about, is it possible to detect autism even in newborns, and even as early as the 2-month well visit. And if you look at some of the parental responses, you can actually see that they will look back and say, when they started getting a little bit older, we realized that they weren't talking, they weren't playing with children of their own age, but when we looked back at 2 months old, they weren't really looking us in the eye. They weren't really making those social smiles at 4 months. And so there are definitely some signs that are present earlier. It's just a matter of recognizing those. And so looking at preservatives, thimerosal is a mercury-containing preservative that prevents bacterial and fungal contamination in vaccines, which is very important. We don't want to be injecting anything into our children that we are unaware of, and certainly don't want to be putting in bacterial or fungal contamination. And there is a lot of concern that thimerosal is linked to autism. And Thompson and the New England Journal of Medicine in 2009, what they did was they actually studied the quantity of mercury exposure from the thimerosal in more than 1,000 children both before and after birth. And all children that were subjected to greater than 40 tests and found no difference between those that received a low dose of thimerosal versus a higher dose. Study after study after study have also shown that there is no link between thimerosal and autism, and was actually never in our MMR vaccine. However, because of the Wakefield study, precautionary measures were taken given the rising concerns, and we saw a plummet in our MMR vaccination rates. And so they removed it from all individual dose vaccines in 2001. So the main vaccine where thimerosal is still present is that multi-dose flu, which is going to be given to those children potentially older than 3 if you use the multi-dose flu in your office, and it may be given to adults. But again, there has not been any link between thimerosal and autism. Aluminum is also one of the major preservatives that a lot of parents have concerns about, and they want to make sure that we are using the low aluminum pneumococcal vaccines and things like that. And so, Dr. Sears writes, when a baby gets the first big round of shots at 2 months, the total dose of aluminum can vary between 295 micrograms to 1,200 micrograms. But aluminum salts are used everywhere. They are used in our vaccines to enhance our immune response from vaccines. So again, very minimal amounts, and it's something that we want in order to be able to get the correct amount of immunity. Safety is well established, and aluminum is abundant in our environment. If we look in breast milk, which most people would say is the most pure, has, by the time that they are 6 months old, children will ingest over 6,700 micrograms. In a cow milk-based formula, they'll get over 37,000. And in soy formula, it is over 100,000 micrograms that they're ingesting by 6 months. So again, aluminum salts are very safe and are well established in that safety, and children are going to be exposed to much more just from their diet than they are from any of their vaccinations. And so what are the big concerns with alternative schedules? And so one is it increases the number of vaccines. So parents want to separate them out, and so they end up getting more shots, and that will potentially lead to more of those minor side effects, which parents are also concerned about, of those fevers, the fussiness, and discomfort. It's going to be more painful to children because they're having to get more injections. It increases the number of office visits, which can also increase the fear that is surrounded by coming to the doctor's office, because every time that they go to the provider's office, they're having to get vaccines. The biggest concern, of course, is that it decreases immunization rates. So a lot of people that are on an alternate schedule may or may not follow up in the timely fashion, or they may be spreading things out so far that it is really just decreasing those rates across the board. And it also, again, increases the time during which children are going to be susceptible to those vaccine-preventable diseases. Then because of that, that will also decrease our herd immunity and increase those potential for vaccine-preventable diseases also in our community and in our older population, not just in our babies. And so the biggest thing that we can do in talking about all vaccine hesitancy and addressing alternate vaccine schedules and looking at refusals is really looking at a strong recommendation from the provider. 80% of parents state that their decision to vaccinate was positively influenced by their provider. So if you are confident about those vaccinations and you are giving a nice strong recommendation, most of your parents are going to come forward and go ahead and vaccinate their children, and hopefully vaccinate them on time. The other, and that strong recommendation, is doing a presumptive versus participatory recommendations. And so we have shown in a number of studies that OPAL published, particularly on vaccinations, is that instead of saying, do you want to vaccinate your child today, you're going to say, today your child's due for these vaccines, or it's time for your child to receive these vaccines today. And so we know that that can be more responded better to by parents and be more of a positive influence, and they're going to vaccinate their children. There are a lot of great resources out there. Of course, the CDC has a wonderful website, and they have some conversations in which you can kind of learn how to address some parents' issues. The AAP has some great resources. The Communicating with Families and Parent Refusal to Vaccination and the Navigating Vaccine Hesitancy are both newer documents and are really fantastic. Immunization Action Coalition has a wonderful website to look at side effects. You can ask providers for expert answers to questions that your parents may bring if you don't know the answer. Some other resources, one of my favorite for parents, but I think also equally great for providers, is the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Vaccine Education Center. It's fantastic. It's easy to understand. It has video. It has written written instructions. It has commonly asked questions, side effects, etc. VaccinateYourBaby.org is a fantastic website as well. And as you may have noticed, a lot of our research and conversation today came out of Dr. Paul Offit's group. He is fantastic. He works for the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, which is likely why their webpage is so phenomenal. But his books and all of his articles are fantastic to look for some resources for both you and your parents. And that's our talk tip for today. Thank you so much. Do you guys have any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Slots. Before we say goodbye, we would like to offer a little more time for last-minute questions, so please type those questions in the chat box below or to the bottom left-hand side of your screen. While we're waiting for those questions to be typed in, just a couple of reminders. If you have requested nursing or pharmacy continuing education credits for today's webinar, please be sure that you complete the survey, which will pop up on your screen when the webinar is ended, or will come through in a post-webinar email. The email will be sent out by the end of today, and all CEUs will be mailed out within the week. And then if you'd like to view or share this webinar, the recording will be available on the Immunize Nevada website along with information for future webinars. Please visit immunizenevada.org/webinars for those details. Does not look like any questions have come through. We got a thank you for you, Dr. Slots, for the resources that you provided. We actually do have one more question that came in. It said, I see a lot of anti-vaxxers claim that there have been no long-term studies that study vaccine safety. Do you have a specific study that I could reference during conversations?
So there's a number of links or a lot of resources in the talk that could potentially be helpful. So looking at like the safety of the pneumococcal vaccine, you can certainly look at the CDC. They have a lot of the links to that. Let me see if I can look back and find. So if we're looking at the safety and efficacy of the varicella vaccine, both Marin and that published in Pediatrics and when in the New England Journal of Medicine, there is not only is it about the efficacy, but there's a lot about the safety of the vaccine. There's a number of articles from Dr. Offit that specifically addresses the safety. But what I would probably point you to is the CDC MMWR. This is going to be present on the CDC website for every single vaccine that's out there. It's going to show when it was put onto the schedule, what was the pre-vaccine, what's been the post-vaccine, and so that may be the best place for you to get something really clear about everything.
Yeah, those are great resources, definitely. And then another question had come in. I recently had an encounter asking about vaccines in aborted baby cells. How would you recommend answering this?
So this is something that has come up a few times, and that not necessarily just baby cells, but also in bovine and other cells, and using live animal cells. And can't we get mad cow disease from this? And looking at aborted baby cells. And this is not actually used in any vaccines. The cells that are used in a vaccine, whether it is designed to look like a bovine cell or designed to look like a human cell, they are all genetically engineered. So this is all laboratory made, nothing in live from human or from cow cells.
Perfect. That's great to know. Well, that will conclude today's NILE webinar. Again, thank you, Dr. Vanessa Slots, and those of you who participated. Have a wonderful day.
Super. Thank you so much.